He was stabbed over 30 times, his blood painted the marble floor, his wife and child slaughtered beside him. The guards didn't flinch, the Städten senators didn't mourn. The people of Rome cheered. This wasn't justice, it was relief. The emperor who slept with his sister had finally died, and not a moment too soon. He was born into a world soaked in power and paranoia. In the year 12 CE, on the edge of an empire that stretched from the misty shores of Britannia to the burning sands of Arabia, a child was born to Germanicus, Rome's golden general, and Agrippina the Elder, a woman of ambition carved from steel. They named him Gaius, but Rome would come to remember him by another name, Caligula, Little Boots. A nickname forged in the camps of the Rhine where soldiers adored the toddler dressed in miniature armour, laughing as he waddled through rows of marching legionaries in custom-made boots. To them he was a mascot, a child of destiny, a good omen. But fate had already marked him for tragedy. At just 7 years old, he watched his father Germanicus, idolised by the troops, adored by the people, die suddenly in Syria under mysterious circumstances. Rumours swirled like vultures. Was he poisoned? Sabotaged by Tiberius, the sitting emperor who feared his popularity? His mother, Agrippina, screamed for justice. She accused the emperor to his face. She paraded her children draped in mourning black through the streets of Rome. The Senate turned cold, the emperor's patience snapped. One by one, Gaius saw his family dismembered, not by sword but by decree. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was banished to a desolate island, where she was reportedly starved to death. His 2 older brothers, Nero and Drusus, were also imprisoned. One was beaten until his bones shattered. The other was said to have committed suicide after months of torture. Only Caligula remained. He was just a teenager when he was summoned to live with Emperor Tiberius at the remote palace on Capri, a palace that history now remembers not for its marble columns or ocean views, but for the depravity that festered within its walls. Suetonius, the ancient biographer, claimed Tiberius surrounded himself with children he called his little fishes, forced into vile acts for his amusement. Whether true or exaggerated, one fact is clear. Caligula was raised in a palace ruled by fear, cruelty, and sadistic indulgence. There, under the watchful eye of an aging, paranoid emperor, Caligula learned the art of survival. Never cry, never trust, never forget. Tiberius himself once said, "I am nursing a viper in Rome's bosom." But he kept the boy close, perhaps out of guilt, or curiosity, or a twisted sense of mentorship. By the time Tiberius died in 37 CE, under suspicious circumstances that some sources attribute to Caligula himself, the boy in boots was a man, smiling at the deathbed of his emperor. And when Rome heard that Caligula had ascended the throne and the streets erupted with joy, prisoners were freed, exiles returned, gladiatorial games were held in celebration. They thought they had a new Augustus, a bringer of peace, a light after the cold shadow of Tiberius. They did not yet see the scars. They did not yet see the rot. But it was already there, buried beneath the golden robes and ceremonial smiles. A child who had watched his mother starve, his brothers bleed, his innocence drowned in the wine-soaked corridors of Capri. A child who had learned that power doesn't protect, it consumes. And now that child had become emperor. Not by birthright, not by virtue, but by outlasting every other heir. The boy in the little boots had returned to Rome, but he was no longer wearing armour for fun, he was wearing it for war. And this time the sword was in his hand. For the first few months, it felt like a miracle. After years of Tiberius's grim rule, marked by silence, treason trials, and whispered executions, Rome suddenly opened its eyes to sunlight. When Caligula became emperor in 37 CE, he was only 24, young, handsome, eloquent, a descendant of Augustus on one side and Mark Antony on the other, the blood of empire and rebellion in his veins. He addressed the Senate with humility. He visited temples in modest robes. He promised the people games, food, forgiveness. He fulfilled those promises. He abolished unjust taxes, brought back political exiles, granted amnesty to prisoners, and gave bonuses to the army that had once adored his father. Temples rang with celebration. The Senate stood in ovation. Even the common people whispered, "This one will be different." It was said that for the first time in years, Roman citizens felt safe. He gave speeches that echoed virtue, hosted games that honoured his ancestors, even wept publicly when addressing the memory of his murdered mother and brothers. and when his favourite sister Drusilla walked beside him at official events, he treated her with respect, tenderness, perhaps too much tenderness, some began to whisper. But in the golden light of early rule, even shadows looked like blessings. Then came the fever. Just 6 months into his reign, Caligula fell ill, very ill. Ancient sources suggest a mysterious disease, possibly epilepsy or a mental breakdown or poison. He hovered on the edge of death. Rome held its breath. Temples filled with prayers, sacrifices were made to Jupiter and Apollo. Drusilla herself reportedly stayed at his side, refusing sleep. And then he recovered. But something had changed. He emerged thinner, paler, colder. The smile remained, but the eyes no longer matched. Behind the mask of youth, something ancient and cruel had taken root. The joy in his voice was now manic. The laughter too loud, the gestures too grand. He began to speak not just as emperor, but as divinity. He no longer addressed the Senate with deference, but with disdain. He no longer attended the games as a host, but as a god to be worshipped. And then he declared Drusilla a living goddess, equal to Venus herself. Roman law had never seen such a thing. Not even Augustus had dared deify a living person. But Caligula didn't care for precedent. When Drusilla died suddenly, perhaps from plague or exhaustion, or something more sinister, Caligula plunged into madness. He declared a national mourning period. He banned laughter, closed the courts, forbade marriages. He had the Senate pass a decree officially deifying her as Diva Drusilla. He forced the empire to weep with him, and behind the veils of mourning something inside him snapped. After Drusilla's death, Caligula was no longer pretending to be good. The mask melted, the blood dried. The monster stepped forward. He no longer sought praise. He demanded worship. He no longer showed mercy. He hunted disobedience. The people who once shouted his name in joy now whispered it in fear, and he, barely 25 years old, had only just begun. He began calling himself Neos Helios, the new sun. He dressed in the robes of Jupiter and Isis, changing costumes depending on his mood. He ordered statues of himself placed in every temple, demanding priests bow to them. Those who hesitated were executed, not quietly, not privately, but publicly with maximum spectacle. The boy once adored for his innocence now stalked the Palatine halls like a lion among rabbits, his smile always fixed, his eyes always searching for weakness, for dissent, for someone to hurt. He had survived poison, betrayal, island exile, and a sickened body. Now he ruled with the certainty of someone who believed they could not die. And when you think you're a god, you stop fearing judgment. You stop feeling guilt. You stop seeing humans as people. You start seeing them as toys, as pawns, as offerings. And so the angel became something else. Something worse than a tyrant. Something worse than a madman. He became a mirror of every cruel impulse Rome had ever buried beneath its marble. And the empire, still cheering in confusion, didn't realize it had opened its gates to hell. Not yet. It began quietly. Not with blood, not with screaming, but with a glance across the table, then the flick of a hand. A senator failed to respond quickly enough to Caligula's joke. His body was found floating in the Tiber the next morning. Cause of death. Disrespect. The era of mercy was over. Caligula no longer wore the robes of a ruler. He wore the faces of gods, changing daily. One morning, Jupiter wrapped in thunderous purple. That evening, Apollo dancing barefoot with a lyre. At dawn, Isis of Egypt, veiled and radiant. His chamber became a costume room, his life a theatre of delusion. But behind the silks and gold leaf, steel was waiting. The first signs of blood came with the family. Caligula turned inward, slicing through the branches of his own bloodline. His cousin Gemellus, once seen as a possible heir, was forced to commit suicide. Accused of treason, based on a single cough in court. Whispers said Caligula had his wife's unborn child cut from her womb and stomped to death, fearing the child might someday threaten him. Another cousin, Lepidus, was executed. Agrippina the younger, his own sister, was exiled. Claudius, the stuttering uncle later made emperor, was spared only because Caligula found him amusing, like a court jester. It was not politics, it was possession. He destroyed anyone who reminded him that he was mortal. Then came the women. Marriage to Caligula meant something closer to captivity. He took wives like changing sandals, 4 in total, often married by force and divorced within days. He reportedly stole one bride directly from the wedding altar of another man. He would parade the wives of senators into his palace, rape them, then describe the details during banquets, laughing as their husbands wept silently at the table. No one could object, no one dared look away. And then there was Drusilla. The rumours had started before her death, of touches too long, glances too soft, jealousy too violent. Some historians, like Suetonius, insist they were lovers, that she was more than a sister, that she was, in his mind, his only equal. When she died, something inside him hollowed out. Caligula began referring to himself as a widower. He called her my wife, my Venus, my twin. He built temples in her name, offered incense to her image. Some claim he slept beside her embalmed body for weeks. Others say he drank wine beside her tomb each night, whispering things no priest dared transcribe. Whether all of it is true, or just embellished by writers desperate to justify his fall, one fact remains. After Drusilla's death, his cruelty became ritual. He no longer simply punished, he performed. Every execution became theatre, every humiliation a ceremony. He once lined prisoners along the Appian Way, then cut their tongues out before tossing them to wild beasts, just to see what sound a man makes when he can't scream. At one banquet, he asked a nobleman why he seemed sad. The man said his brother had just died. Caligula responded, "Then you shall join him." And the man's head was taken before dessert. He began auctioning off the lives of gladiators mid-fight, mocking the crowd's pleas for mercy as bad theatre. He turned the palace into a brothel, filled it with nobles' wives and sons, forcing them to serve guests for his amusement. Payment went directly to the imperial treasury. He told Rome he was broke, but he still constructed floating palaces, paved roads across water, and filled fountains with wine. He said it was to show power, but it looked more like a child setting fire to his own toys, and still no one stopped him. Because Rome had grown afraid not just of the man, but of the silence that surrounded him. A silence built by fear, fed by blood, enforced by 1,000 knives. The man who once played in little boots among the soldiers now ordered them to kill without trial, without reason, without hesitation. The boy who once smiled at the crowds from his father's arms now sent their sons to the arena unarmed, forced to fight lions with bare hands for the pleasure of an emperor who drank wine and watched without blinking. It had only been 2 years, and already the empire was beginning to rot from within. This was no longer about madness, this was transformation. The Palatine Hill was no longer a palace. It was a stage. White marble gleamed under torchlight. Curtains of silk danced in the breeze. Bronze statues cast long shadows along the colonnades. And beneath all that splendour, the floor was slick with blood. Not metaphorically, literally. Here, in the very heart of Roman power, the emperor turned cruelty into art. Every corridor echoed with new forms of degradation. The senators, those men once cloaked in dignity, were now puppets, dressed in women's garments, forced to crawl on hands and knees, barking like dogs for Caligula's amusement. When they fell out of favour, they didn't disappear quietly. They were paraded naked through the forum, whipped until their backs split open or stripped of their eyes, tongues and teeth, yet kept alive as warnings. Caligula didn't just want them dead, he wanted them broken. To him, the Senate was not a governing body, it was a circus, and he was the ringmaster, the god-emperor, the sadistic audience of one. One night during a lavish banquet, Caligula stood and named his horse Incitatus as consul. The room went silent. The senators stared, unsure whether it was a joke or a test. The emperor smiled. The next morning golden stables were built, ivory feeding bowls were crafted, purple togas were sewn for the animal, and Rome, the mighty empire, held its breath and nodded in obedience. Was it madness, or was it mockery? Either way, no one dared laugh. Outside the palace, trials became meaningless. If Caligula disliked your haircut, your scent, the way you blinked, he could sentence you to death on the spot, and he often did. At one public event, a man cheered too enthusiastically. Caligula had him dragged from the stands, flogged, and thrown from the Tarpeian rock. When asked why, he shrugged. He disturbed me. Another man once complained about the price of grain. Caligula responded by executing him, then burning his home with his family inside. The body was left in the street for days, unburied, unnoticed, He turned executions into dinner theatre. He would host evening feasts where, between courses, prisoners were marched in, flayed alive, or dismembered limb by limb, while guests were forced to continue eating. Those who vomited were punished. Those who looked away were called cowards. And then there were the games. The Colosseum hadn't been built yet, but Rome still bled for sport. And under Caligula, the arena became a sacred altar of death. He ordered noble-born children to fight wild animals. He forced cripples and the elderly to battle one another with clubs. He delighted in seeing blood on white sand, especially if the victim was beautiful. Sometimes he chose victims personally. He once pointed at a row of spectators and murmured, "I could have all your throats slit, and no one would stop me." And no one did, because Caligula had built something stronger than loyalty. Stronger than fear, he had built hopelessness. His guards didn't protect him, they enabled him. They became the tools through which Rome tore itself apart. Even the gods were not safe. He ordered that statues of Jupiter, Neptune and Mars be torn down, their heads removed and replaced with his own likeness. Temples once filled with incense and prayer now held bronze masks of Caligula's smiling face. He walked barefoot through the forum dressed as Mercury, demanding passers-by worship him on the spot. Those who hesitated, beaten, stripped, hung upside down from lampposts until their lungs filled with blood. He no longer whispered about his divinity, he screamed it. He no longer asked for loyalty. He took it, like he took everything else, through pain. And Rome watched. Powerful families moved into silence. Poets stopped writing. Philosophers vanished. Even laughter became dangerous. The wrong smile at the wrong moment could be seen as mockery, punishable by death. And in the palace, Caligula walked alone most nights, trailing a robe too long, muttering to himself, staring into mirrors, as if trying to see someone else, someone lost, someone buried, someone murdered long ago, perhaps on an island named Capri. But whoever that child once was, he was gone now. All that remained was the performance, the god, the monster, the king of Rome's slow suicide, and still the marble gleamed. She walked beside him like a shadow of myth, neither queen nor mistress, neither hostage nor sovereign. Her name was Drusilla, his sister, and perhaps his only true possession. Of all the women who passed through Caligula's life, brides stolen, wives discarded, noble ladies defiled, only Drusilla remained untouched by cruelty, but not untouched by something deeper, something darker. Even before his rise to power, Caligula kept her close, too close. They dined together, slept under the same roof, travelled side by side. Ancient sources, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, even whispers buried in imperial court letters, hinted at a relationship that crossed bloodlines and moral lines alike. Lowen, not whispered, spoken, openly, brazenly, as if daring the gods to strike. Some said she was his lover, others said she was his obsession. But to Caligula, Drusilla was more than a sister. She was an extension of himself. He once told a senator, "No man touches what is mine, not gold, not Rome, not Drusilla." When he became emperor, she was elevated beyond nobility. He granted her unprecedented honours, often reserved only for empresses or goddesses. She sat beside him during senatorial meetings, joined him in ceremonial processions, even appeared on official coins, unheard of for a Roman woman who was not a wife. And then she died. Suddenly, violently, at just 21 years old. Some said plague, others whispered abortion gone wrong. There were even murmurs, never confirmed, that Caligula himself had ended her life in a fit of rage or jealousy or delusion. But the cause did not matter. The aftermath did. Rome expected mourning. They did not expect a funeral fit for Jupiter himself. They did not expect Caligula to ban all marriages, all laughter, all festivals, declaring a year of grief. They did not expect him to deify her publicly, officially. She was given the title Diva Drusilla, and shrines to her were built in every province. Worship of the emperor's dead sister became state religion. One senator dared ask, "Why grant her honours reserved for Venus?" Caligula smiled, "Because she was my Venus." He built her a golden statue, offered daily sacrifices, ordered the priestesses of Vesta to include her name in their chants. Some claimed he placed her ashes beside his bed. Others said he slept with her corpse for nights, refusing to let go. Even if half the stories are exaggerations, they reflect a terrifying truth. Drusilla's death shattered the last human tether inside Caligula. She had been the one soul he did not try to dominate, because she had always been his, and without her there were no more lines, no more boundaries, only ashes. After her funeral, Caligula's attire changed. He no longer wore Roman garments. Instead, he donned the robes of Eastern gods, priests, even Egyptian pharaohs. He told the Senate he was the reincarnation of Osiris, and Drusilla was his Isis, not metaphorically, but literally. He declared that she had ascended to the heavens and that her spirit entered the stars, watching over him, guiding his hand. And every time a senator disobeyed, every time a noble woman refused his advances, he would simply say, "She saw that." The dead woman became his witness, his excuse, his fury. It did not end there. When he married again, a brief, farcical union with Caesonia, a woman already pregnant, he made one thing clear. "You are my wife," he told her, "but you are not Drusilla." Even Caesonia lived in the shadow of the dead, and so the empire began to rot with incense. With golden altars built not to Rome's ancestors, but to a woman whose only crime was being loved by a brother too much, and too wrongly. Drusilla was never accused of ambition, never plotted, never ruled. She was simply taken, by him, by fate, by madness. And in losing her, Caligula lost the last illusion of restraint. He had made love into possession, death into ceremony, and memory into religion. The sister was gone, but the worshipper remained, forever kneeling before the ghost he created and the god he imagined himself to be. He no longer whispered that he was a god, he declared it, loudly to daily, without hesitation. The boy once known as Little Boots now wore the robes of Jupiter, spoke with the arrogance of Apollo, and danced like Bacchus in the marble halls of his palace. One moment he was the sun god Helios, radiant and golden, blessing the Roman people with his divine light. The next he was Isis of Egypt, veiled, inscrutable, terrifying. And the Roman Empire, too exhausted to protest, nodded in fear and submission. He ordered that statues of himself replace those of ancient gods. Heads of Jupiter, Neptune and Mars were hacked off in temples, replaced by busts of Caligula's own face. In one temple, he even placed a mirror in front of his statue, so he could admire his own reflection during ceremonies. He built a temple to himself on the Palatine Hill, where priests, trained Roman nobles, were forced to perform ritual sacrifices to Divus Caligula. Their prayers no longer called upon Jupiter. They were offered directly to a living man, a man with trembling hands, a man with a smile that never matched his eyes, and if you didn't bow, you didn't breathe. He created a new cult, a priesthood dedicated to his glory. The position of High Priest of Caligula was auctioned to the highest bidder, and once purchased, demanded near impossible gifts and endless grovelling. One noble sold 3 villas just to afford the role. He died bankrupt, trembling, terrified of failing in his duties, but the worst was still to come. When Caligula's divine ego outgrew Rome, he turned eastward, to Judea. He ordered that his statue be erected inside the Temple of Jerusalem, the most sacred site in the Jewish world. To the Jews, this was blasphemy, idolatry, an unthinkable desecration. When news reached the region, rebellion threatened to explode. The Roman governor, Petronius, delayed the order, stalling for time, knowing that if he obeyed Caligula, war would erupt. The emperor responded with fury. He ordered Petronius to commit suicide. The letter, however, arrived after Caligula's own death, sparing the governor. But the message was clear. No god but Caligula, no voice but his. Even the seas were not immune to his madness. In a fit of delusion, Caligula declared war on Neptune, the god of the ocean. He gathered his legions at the coast of Gaul, stood before the waves, and ordered his soldiers to stab the sea with their swords. They beat the surf with spears, shouted battle cries, launched projectiles into the water. When the battle was over, Caligula announced victory. As spoils of war, the soldiers were commanded to gather seashells from the shore. He called them the spoils of Neptune, and paraded them triumphantly back to Rome. It would have been comical, if not for the fact that any man who laughed risked beheading. Behind the absurdity was something darker, a mind unravelling, a man drowning in the mask of a god he could no longer remove. He began to speak of immortality, of ascending beyond flesh, of being born from lightning. He claimed to control the sunrise, that the moon dimmed if he frowned, that the gods envied his beauty. He once declared, "If only Rome had one neck, I would sever it with a single stroke." But Rome did not have one neck. It had many, and they were all slowly being crushed beneath the heel of a god who bled like a man. In the final months of his reign, Caligula ordered human sacrifices, claiming they were offerings to appease his divine hunger. Prisoners were burned alive in bronze bulls. Pregnant women were thrown into pits, their bodies never recovered. Children, taken from noble homes, disappeared overnight. And in the palace he laughed, he dined, he held orgies, he recited poems to himself as bodies were dragged out behind him. One day he stood on a high balcony overlooking the forum. He lifted his arms and whispered, "You are all ants. I could crush you in one breath." Lo, the people watched in silence. Some bowed, some trembled. None dared blink, because when a god walks among men, truth becomes fragile, justice a joke, and every altar is just a pile of bones waiting to be used. It began, as all rebellions do, not with shouts, but with silence. A silence thick and dangerous, the kind that settles before a storm, the kind that lingers in the hallways of palaces where laughter once echoed, but now only footsteps remain. Even gods can bleed, and even emperors can be watched. By now, Caligula trusted no one. He had replaced advisors with flatterers, generals with dancers, scribes with spies. His palace was no longer a centre of governance, but a labyrinth of paranoia. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating at regular hours. He paced alone in dark corridors, muttering to himself, tracing invisible symbols on marble columns. He would look over his shoulder mid-sentence. He would test the loyalty of guards by ordering them to kill a fellow soldier, just to watch who hesitated. Those who paused died. Those who obeyed died later for knowing too much. Even his bodyguards no longer breathed freely. Among them was a man named Cassius Caria, a senior officer in the Praetorian Guard, a veteran, once respected, loyal to Rome, but Caligula had turned him into a joke. Because Caria had a soft voice, the emperor mocked him in public, assigning him feminine passwords, calling him Venus, sweetheart, priestess. In court, Caligula would giggle as he barked orders, "Give the lady a sword," and Caria would bow, bite his tongue, and endure, because to resist was death. But mockery plants seeds, and humiliation is a slow-burning fuel. Caria began to gather whispers, not conspirators, yet, just eyes, just ears, men who had also been degraded, men who had lost brothers, wives, fortunes, for nothing more than the emperor's mood. They were senators, guards, slaves, all of them broken in different ways, all of them waiting. The turning point came in early 41 CE. Caligula, in another display of arrogance, announced plans to move the imperial seat from Rome to Alexandria, so that he might be worshipped more fully as a living god. Rome panicked. The Senate whispered. The guard clenched their jaws. He was not just mad, he was planning to abandon Rome altogether, to leave the capital, the heart of the empire, in ruins, while he surrounded himself with incense, gold, and puppets in Egypt. To the Romans it was betrayal, and betrayal, unlike madness, had consequences. The plot came together in 3 days, fast, quiet. A thread pulled tight behind velvet curtains. They would strike at the palace, not during a Senate meeting, too guarded, not at night, too unpredictable, but during the Ludi Palatini, the palace games. Caligula would be vulnerable, distracted, surrounded by sound and wine and dancing bodies. The stage was set. On the morning of January 24th, 41 CE, Caligula rose in his robes of gold. He drank, he smiled, he kissed his daughter. He walked into the palace theatre to watch performances he had personally arranged, a musical praising his own divinity. He laughed, louder than anyone. After the performance, he left the hall through a covered passageway, flanked by a handful of guards, Chaerea among them. The corridor was long, dark, empty. Chaerea approached from behind. No hesitation, no flourish. The first blade entered Caligula's neck from behind, just above the shoulder. He twisted, shrieked. Too late. More knives followed. Dozens. They didn't just kill him, they mutilated him. Over 30 stab wounds, to the face, to the groin, to the belly. His screams echoed against the stone walls, unheard beyond the guard's steel ring. They said his last words were not divine. not majestic, but simply, I'm still alive. Then they killed his wife, his child, everyone who bore his blood. It was not justice, it was purge, a divine cleansing performed by mortal hands. His body was left in the corridor for hours, bleeding, twitching, unburied. When word reached the Senate, some wept in public, but in private they exhaled. And when the news reached the people of Rome, there were no riots. Only wine, only music, only laughter. The god was dead, and the empire for the first time in years could breathe again. But they did not know what they had inherited. Not peace, not order, but something darker. A legacy of silence. A fear that gods may rise again, cloaked in flesh, crowned in madness, fed by obedience. He lay face down in the corridor, surrounded by silence. The man who once made Rome cruel, who turned senators into dogs and gods into mirrors, now bled into the cracks of palace marble, alone, twitching, gasping, his golden robe soaked in his own blood. Not a martyr, not a symbol, just a broken body, stabbed over 30 times, groin mutilated, eyes wide open in disbelief. No one rushed to save him. No hand reached for comfort. Even his guards had walked away. For hours no one moved him. He was left as a warning, as a release, and when they finally came to collect what remained, it wasn't the Senate, nor the priests, nor the nobility. It was his servants, the silent ones, the shadows he never noticed. They found his wife's body nearby, her neck snapped. His daughter, barely 2 years old, was reportedly slammed against a wall, her skull crushed. There was no dignity in death for Caligula, no final rites, no imperial procession, no people lining the streets in mourning, just whispers, just footsteps, just the quiet relief of a city waking from a nightmare. The Senate met in secret the next morning. Some argued they should restore the Republic, others feared civil war. In the chaos, one man was dragged from obscurity, Claudius, Caligula's uncle, the man everyone had dismissed as a stammering fool. He was found hiding behind a curtain in the palace, trembling, expecting to be killed. Instead, the Praetorian Guard hailed him as emperor. The wheel turned. A new face, a new god. But what of the old one? The Senate feared that even in death Caligula might inspire by a cult worship. They remembered how he had turned his dead sister into a goddess. They refused a state funeral, refused to honor him, refused to speak his name in public again. So his body was stolen away in the night, under cover of fog and silence. Not paraded, but smuggled, like contraband. Accounts say he was partially cremated in secret, his ashes hidden in a shallow grave on the Esquiline Hill, a place once used to bury plague victims and slaves. No monument, no inscription, just dirt, and even that wasn't safe. Years later, when political tides shifted, some supporters of Caligula tried to dig up his remains and reinter them in the mausoleum of Augustus, alongside emperors who had earned reverence. But the damage had been done. His legacy had already been sealed, not in stone, but in shame. Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, all chronicled his life with venom. They painted him not as a man, but as a monster, a rapist of senators' wives, a god pretender, a sacrificer of children, a mad tyrant who waged war on the sea. Even if half the stories were exaggeration, even if some were inventions by political enemies, truth no longer mattered. Caligula had become myth, a cautionary tale, a template for madness, a name whispered to frighten children and emperors alike. No songs were written for him, no temples rebuilt. Even statues of his likeness were smashed, buried, or recarved to resemble other emperors. Rome didn't just kill Caligula, it erased him. The people who once cheered him into power now acted as if he had never existed. A 4-year reign wiped from public celebration, remembered only in scrolls and shivers. But the memory couldn't be fully buried, because every tyrant who came after him, Nero, Commodus, Caracalla, was compared to Caligula. His name became a warning etched into imperial memory. Don't laugh too loud, don't love too much. Don't believe yourself to be a god. Because Rome has seen what happens when it worships a man instead of a law. And yet, Rome had created him, fed him, obeyed him, clapped when he joked, bowed when he demanded, and when the blood dried and the throne was washed clean, and another emperor sat where Caligula had once stood, the cycle continued, as it always had, as it always will. You won't find his name carved in honor, Not on arches, not on temples, not on coins, at least not anymore. Gaius Julius Caesar. Augustus Germanicus, better known as Caligula, was not just assassinated, he was erased. Rome didn't want him remembered as a ruler. They wanted him remembered as a disease, a fever the empire survived by sweating through blood. After his death, the Senate declared damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. It wasn't enough to bury the body, they wanted to bury the idea of him. Statues were torn down, faces chipped off marble. In some cases, sculptors were ordered to recarve his busts into the likeness of Claudius. Reliefs on temples were scraped, inscriptions scratched out, his name removed from every public monument, as if Rome could simply pretend he never wore the purple robe. But memory is not marble. Memory lingers, in stories, in nightmares, in the corners of silence where trauma curls up and refuses to die. And so, ironically, the more Rome tried to forget him, the more they ensured he would never be forgotten. His name, Caligula, became a symbol, a warning, a whispered curse among rulers and subjects alike. He wasn't remembered for reforms, not for laws, not for conquests. He was remembered for madness, for excess, for making Rome watch as he shattered every boundary between man and monster, and then demanded applause. Generations of Roman emperors lived under his shadow. Nero was called the second Caligula. Commodus was called Caligula reborn. Even later tyrants, centuries removed, were compared to him, not as leaders but as cautionary tales. Even now, 2,000 years later, his name survives not in admiration but in disgust. Books still call him the Mad Emperor. Films and operas still depict him as a sadist draped in gold, eyes hollow with power. Psychologists cite him in case studies on narcissistic disorder and unchecked sociopathy. But what if that's exactly what Rome wanted? What if the horror of Caligula has been exaggerated not to condemn him, but to protect themselves? Because if Caligula was simply insane, a fluke of blood and brain, then Rome could wash its hands. But if he was a product of Rome, if he was forged by its ambition, shaped by its cruelty, raised by its paranoia, then the madness wasn't in one man, it was in the system, the Senate who bowed too quickly, the generals who followed too blindly, the people who laughed when they should have spoken, the gods who stayed silent as children burned. They all played a part, and so Caligula's crimes became louder, more theatrical, more monstrous, because the more monstrous he was, the more innocent Rome could pretend to be. But the cracks remain. Historians still argue over details. Did he really sleep with his sister? Did he truly wage war on the sea? Did he actually eat dinner while watching people flayed alive? Some say yes, some say no, some say it doesn't matter. Because what matters is the symbol he became, a child born into blood, a boy who wore little boots and watched his family die, a teenager trained by a sadist emperor, a young man given absolute power and no limits. He stepped into the role the empire handed him, and then he destroyed it from within, and when he died, Rome didn't mourn. They breathed, they erased, they rewrote. But behind every polished marble floor, behind every statue of a new emperor, behind every prayer whispered to Jupiter, there remained the echo of a voice that once declared, "I could kill you all, and no one would stop me." And he was right. Until the end, no one did. There's a tendency, when history presents us with monsters, to distance ourselves from them. We point, we condemn, we whisper, "He was We comfort ourselves with the illusion that madness is a personal failing, not a social one. But madness, unchecked, fed, applauded, becomes a collective crime. And Caligula was never alone in his madness. He was not raised in a vacuum. He was raised by a paranoid emperor, trained in a palace where cruelty was power, rewarded for silence, praised for submission, taught, long before he ruled, that life was cheap and loyalty was weaker than fear. He was forged by the very people who would later claim to hate him. And they were the same people who laughed at his jokes, clapped at his games, watched his spectacles, and bowed when he called himself a god. So the question isn't just, how could Caligula become such a monster? The better question is, what kind of world allowed him to exist for so long? Because tyrants don't grow in darkness. They grow in light, in applause, in unchecked power, in rituals of flattery that replace truth with survival. And when the applause fades, when the knives come out, the system simply replaces the mask, puts a new man on the throne, and buries the body of the last god it created. But the pattern remains. In that sense, Caligula was not the disease. He was the symptom, the warning flare, the price of a culture that made emperors divine and stripped humanity from their souls. What can we learn from him? That power without limits becomes hunger. That trauma left untreated becomes destruction. That when a society worships authority more than accountability, it creates monsters it can no longer control. And perhaps most haunting of all, Caligula wasn't the last. History is full of rulers who followed his path. Some wore robes, some wore crowns, some wore suits, but the script remained the same. A man rises, proclaims himself savior, then God. People bow, people suffer, people die, and then we pretend to forget, but we remember. Because deep down we know. The next Caligula isn't born, he's made, and unless we break the pattern, unless we dare to name the silence, he'll rise again, not in Rome, but somewhere, anywhere, not because it's ancient, but because it feels familiar. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more stories history tried to bury. Let the past speak before it repeats itself.